Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon, Charles Metcalfe in Portugal, right?
In Portugal.
Yes, good afternoon, Poland. Hello, hi. This is the new Douro and Charles Metcalfe, the one and only. Yes, but before we start, let me just express my, how to say it in English, Charles? Could you express it in
I think
English?
express my thanks would be very appropriate.
Express my thanks, my great merci to the embassy of Portugal in Poland, to the ICEP Global for their great help. Yes, could you say it in proper English, Charles?
I would like to say a huge thank you to the Portuguese embassy in Poland and to ICEP for their help in actually getting the wines to you, because it's not as easy as it might be in some places. And they really helped us at a late stage when we were getting a little worried about it.
Yes, that's it. So, Charles, we start now. Thank you very much for your help.
Pleasure.
And yes, let's start the tasting. And hello, everyone. Yes, Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Piotr. Good morning, good afternoon, rather, and welcome to this tasting. The new Douro. This is a tasting which has come about because of a tasting I went to in Regua, which is in the western part of the port region, and I met a group of tasters who title themselves the New Douro, and it's a group of very good companies. And I talked about the fact that I'd done a tasting for good people in Poland before with the Alentejo, with Douro, and would love to do one for Douro. And within half an hour, one of the organizers of the tasting came back and said, right, I found the people who'd like to take part. We'll do the tasting. So we had one little hiccup because we couldn't get the wines to you as fast as we had hoped. But now here we are, and I hope you've got all the wines. I've got all the wines in front of me here in Portugal. And so let's get on to the tasting. I'm going to talk a little bit about Portugal to start with. This is a slide from the Wines of Portugal website. It's a map of wine Portugal, and I'm just going to show you up here. Can you see here numbers 3 and 4? These bits here in the north, the sort of northwest of Portugal. This big area up here is Vinho Verde, but then 3 and 4 is the Douro Valley, and 3 and 4, because this same area also covers the denomination which is Porto. So you've got two denominations within the same area, one for DOC Douro, which is the unfortified wine made in this region, and the other for port wine, which of course is fortified. So that's where it is. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And that then is from the IVDP, the Instituto dos Vinhos do Douro e Porto, the Port Wine Institute. This is the map of the Douro wine region. Can we just go back for a moment, please, Piotr, to the slide before? And I'd just like to make the point that the region itself starts about halfway between the Atlantic here, that's the Atlantic, and then the coast with Spain, or the border with Spain. It's not a coast at this stage, although it looks a bit like that in the coast. So the actual, there is almost half the distance between Spain and the Atlantic before the Douro and Port Rhine region starts. Thanks very much. Let's go back. So this is that region. So you have to imagine somewhere over here to the west is Vinho Verde country, the city of Porto, the city of Vila Nova de Gaia, where many port wines are aged, blended and aged and shipped. But this is the part of Portugal where the wines for Douro DOC are grown. Just to repeat, it's Douro, which is the denomination for unfortified wine, and Porto, which is the one for fortified wine. But basically, it all takes place in the same region. It's a fascinating region, and actually, the River Douro itself has 3 UNESCO World Heritage sites along its length. One in the city of Porto, the old part of the city of Porto. One for the upper, it's the upper Douro vineyards, this area here really. And then there's another one down here by Foz, which is one that was found more recently, some Neolithic, quite a lot of Neolithic engravings that were found on rocks in just close to Foz, which is also gained UNESCO World Heritage status. So it's a very interesting place, the Douro Valley, and it's beautiful. It is so beautiful. It has terraces, it has slopes, it has mountains. Talking mountains, two of the people that I spoke to while I was researching for this tasting, two of them said, well, you know, the Douro has 50% of the mountain vineyards in the world. Well, I don't know if that's true, but they do have a lot of mountain vineyards. And even some of the vineyards that aren't quite as high, because if you think of those places in the world, there are many places in the world, Switzerland, Alto Adige, Chile, there are many places with mountainous vineyards, but the Douro does have very steep slopes. It was a very a very dangerous river years ago, which had to be traversed. It could only be really done by boat because traveling by ox was too slow. Ox cart was impossible. So they would move the wines around by boat, and it was a dangerous journey. Now there are, I think, 7 dams along the length of the vineyards in the Douro Valley in Portugal, and so it's really more a series of flat lakes with dams between them. The dams, of course, provide electricity, which before they were created just didn't exist in the Douro Valley. If you wanted electricity, you had to get a petrol or a diesel-fired generator. And so a lot of the houses and bases and wineries didn't have electricity until really relatively recently. What else should I say? It almost all has to be worked by hand. There are places with slightly lower slopes, gentler slopes, particularly around this part of the eastern part of the region. The slopes get a bit gentler, and you can actually work some of them by machine. And again, here in the west part, there are some slopes that you can be worked by machine, but most of it has to be worked by hand. And as a couple of people said to me, 80% of the costs of the expenses of working vines in the Douro is the labor. It's the man, or very often woman power. So it's a fascinating place. It's difficult. It's expensive to grow grapes. Costs are difficult. Various people said, you know, they made comparison between the costs of grapes in the Douro Valley and elsewhere, either in other parts of Portugal, for instance, the Alentejo, which is much flatter. It's got gentle hills, but not the sort of steep hills that you have in the Douro. It is much more expensive. And here, and someone also made a comparison with Chile, a country where he'd done some winemaking, and he said, you know, Chile, it's much easier, it's much less expensive because you can't sell Douro wine below €2 a bottle. That's just the cost of making it. Whereas in Chile, you could, in the Douro, a kilogram of grapes costs perhaps €1.20. In Chile, you can get it for 10 cents. So you've got a double handicap, because in Chile, of course, you have no phylloxera, so you don't have to worry about grafting your vineyards either. So you've got a low yield and high cost here in the Douro Valley. Comparing it with the Alentejo, for instance, in the Alentejo, you can get much higher yields and lower costs because you can do a lot of work by machine. Anyway, the Douro is still port heavy in terms of what is made here, both from the point of view of reputation and also the quantity. There are 3 different areas of the Douro, really. There's the Baixa Corgo. The Corgo is one of the rivers, one of the tributaries of the. Here we have, you see, here you have the Douro Valley running through, crossing the, and then down into, and then here in which the border with Spain. Here, it's what's known as the International Douro, because on the eastern side is the border with Spain, on the western side, the border with Portugal. But the three areas are the Baixo Corgo, the Lower Corgo, which is roughly sort of about like here. It's the western end. There's a big mountain just here called the Serra de Marão, which keeps a lot of the wetter weather, the Atlantic weather, away from the eastern part of the Douro River, the Douro region. Then in the central part, which is roughly sort of like this. In the central part, that's the Cima Corgo, the Upper Corgo, and then the Douro Superior, as you might guess, the Upper Douro, that's the eastern end. So it's all this part here. Really, it's the eastern. It's hotter, it's drier, the yields are lower. There's much less rain, and it's more difficult to make wine. You get lower yields, even though in some places the slopes are slightly gentler, and there's even a little bit of mechanization that can be done. Altitude is another very important factor, because some of these up here, what's called the plateau of Alijo, this town here, that's sort of 500 to 700 meters. It's really quite mountainous up there, whereas down by the river, down here, it's going down to sort of 120, and along here it gradually rises as you go along the Douro from the east in Spain to the west down here towards Porto. So altitude is another big difference. They say again, every 100 meters, you probably, if you're going upwards, you lose a temperature, a degree of average temperature. So it's quite important if you're 500 meters up, that's 5 degrees difference in terms of the average temperature for the vines. Great varieties. Actually, let's move on to the next slide. We've talked a bit about the place. Next slide, then. That's just a wonderful picture of the Douro. This is Quinta do Crasto, a very good quinta. We don't happen to have one of their wines today, but it's a lovely shot of the kind of wonderful terraced vineyards you see here. Here you have some slightly older vineyards which are planted vertically. I mean, I say vertically, it's a relatively gentle slope. But then here, immediately on a higher slope, and you've got to plant terraces with these walls. So here you have terraces with what they call patamares, which are earth slopes between, and then these ones here are old stone terraces. The Douro, again, running along there. And just to the top here, you see that little area of light. That is a swimming pool. I know because I've swum there. So that's Quinta do Crasto in the autumn. A beautiful view of a wonderful wine region. Okay, next slide, please. Total vineyard area, just a few numbers if you want to come back to. I'm not going to linger too long because you can look them up. There will be there is a recording of this. So if you want to come back, here are all the figures. Total vineyard area, 44,000 hectares roughly. And most of that, nearly 41,000 is approved for Douro DOC wine. When I say Douro DOC, I mean Douro DOC and Porto DOC. Whereas the vineyards approved for Douriense, that is the regional wine, these are vineyards which perhaps don't quite obey the rules. They're not made of the grapes which are permitted in the Douro region. A good example, for instance, is Syrah or Shiraz. There's quite a bit of Shiraz being grown now in the Douro, but they can't use it for Douro wine. It has to be just Douriense, the regional wine. So that's a much smaller figure. And the Douro represents 22% of Portugal's vineyard area. The Alentejo is bigger, but the Douro, I think, is number 2 in the pecking order. Okay, next slide, please. Climate, hot, dry summer, cold, usually rainy winter. If it doesn't rain in the winter, they have problems the next year because they don't have the reserves of water that they need. There's the Serra de Marão that I talked of, which divides the Vinha Verde region from the Douro and protects the Douro region from the damp Atlantic climate. The rainfall increases from east to west, 15 dams on the Douro River, 7 in Spain, 8 in Portugal. So it's 8 dams, and that's where they get quite a lot of hydroelectricity from. So, but it has turned the river from a dangerous river, dangerous to navigate, where people lost their lives in boats, into a series of flat lakes. The temperatures can go down to freezing in winter. I've been up in the Douro Valley where there's snow on the ground, but they can rise to well over 30 degrees in summer. It can be very hot, particularly the eastern end of the Douro. Last 2 years have been dry, but actually this year here, this 22 winter, there was quite a bit of rain, and so they were able to make up. Okay, next slide. What are the factors that influence Douro wine? Well, Mediterranean mountain climate. Mediterranean, the kind of plants you get here are plants like vines, like olive trees. There are a few almond trees. Of course, there are little patches where people are growing vegetables. The soils, 2 main soils. Now, this is quite interesting, mainly schist and granite. Much of Portugal's rock is granite, but there is schist which runs almost all the length of the Douro Valley. And when you go away from the sides of the valley, it quite often goes back into granite. Granite is a cold soil. Schist heats up in the sun. It breaks easily, depending which way the formation is. It breaks easily. So schist is good from the point of view of getting water into the soil because it can run between the cracks in the rock and make its way down to the roots. Granite is more difficult. Before it's broken up, it's very hard to get for the roots to get a hold in the soil. But over time, granite decomposes into a sort of coarse sand, and that then goes through, the water goes through very quickly to the roots. Altitude, we talked a little bit about altitude. Aspect, which way does the vineyard face? Now you have every way. Basically, it's a river which goes roughly east-west, but within that there are wiggles, there are bends in the river. So sometimes you have an aspect which is east-facing, which is obviously it gets the morning sun, it's much cooler, it doesn't get so much sun during the day. The western gets a lot of sun, so the hottest aspect is southwest, and that's where most of the port vineyards are clustered, facing southwest or south, because they get the most sun and they need that high sugar from which we turned into alcohol in the grapes for port. Grapes for table wine, for Douro DOC, tend to be grown in less hot vineyards, so either higher or else north-facing, east-facing. And that's a big difference because there are some vineyards which didn't really get very much used, and there were lots of sort of barren bits of just a bush and perhaps olive trees. But now that there is a big industry making unfortified wine, they then are used and they're very useful for the cooler slopes. Grape varieties we'll talk about in a bit, but I mean, the point about the Douro is that it's, with a few exceptions, it's Portuguese grape varieties, and particularly Douro grape varieties. Viticulture and winemaking, interesting, because you will see in the pictures that you see, you'll see the ways in which they train the vines. It's usually cordon trained, I think, nowadays. They used to be guillot, but that is going slightly out of fashion. And there is a little bit of a movement to start thinking about what you would call bush vines, just individual vines, because you can get better leaf cover from the really hot temperatures you get in the summer. Okay, next slide, please. So here we have a nice picture of the Douro Valley. You see all those slopes, all those different mountains. Here's a sort of village down the bottom, but this is quite a steep slope from down here to that road down there. And the mountains just continue on and on and on. It's a very dramatic place. If you haven't been to the Douro Valley before, And I'm sure there must be some amongst you who have, but please do go. It is astonishingly beautiful. And one of the good things about it is that you can travel by the river. You can either take the train from Porto out here in the west, and you can travel all the way along to very nearly the border with Spain, a place called Pocinho, where there happens to be a very good restaurant serving amazingly tender beef. But you can take that train along, and you take the train along, have a nice meal somewhere. You could stop at Pinhão, you could stop at Regua, and you could stop at various places and have a nice meal, and then make your way back by train. Or you can take a boat along the river. There are quite a lot of riverboats now, more and more tourism, as we'll talk a little bit about later. Anyway, next slide. Now, white grapes. You see what names do you recognize there? Well, you know, Valdelho you might recognize because it's used in it's a great grape of Madeira, although in Douro it's called Gouveia. Malvasia fina might ring a sort of bell. Malvasia, there's Malvasias in Italy, Malvoisie in France. Social, another of the great grapes of Madeira, very high acid. Terentege, known in the Douro as Folgazão, that's another lesser planted grape in Madeira. But they're all Portuguese grapes. There's not a single non-Portuguese grape amongst them. And I find that very exciting because the flavors of these grapes are different. Okay, next slide. But I think we're about to have, there's a small shot of a little bit of Catherine's thumb, I think, my wife's thumb, and a little bit of the edge of our car mirror as we stop to take this picture. But let's move on. Another beautiful shot of the Douro Valley, and we're going to move on. We're going to open a bottle of wine because it's about time. You've waited long enough. Here we go. Next slide, please. Caves Transmontana. So this is going to be a bottle of sparkling wine. Here we have a photo of the two guys who actually make the wines, Celso Pereira and his co-winemaker Pedro Guedes, who is another extremely good winemaker. Sorry, I've just clicked on the wrong thing. Let me get back to where I was. That's a bit better. So it's Celso Pereira here and Pedro Guedes. So I'm just going to get this bottle open. This is the sparkling wine that we've got here called Vertice. And it's a wine which, thank you very much. On we move. That gives you all the detail you need to know about the wine. It's a blend of Chardonnay and Gouveia. So 60% Chardonnay and 40% Gouveia, which, as you probably remember, is the other name for Social, the Madeira Social. The interesting thing about this wine, I tasted several of. I went to Caves Transmontana, Vertice, and I tasted various wines with Celso. Pedro wasn't there, but Celso, there we are. It's the right kind of sound. There you see a bottle having just been opened and me pouring myself a small amount. Celso has been there from the very beginning. This was a business that was started back in, thank you, Catherine, taking the bottle from me. It was started, actually, it was interesting because it was a couple of Americans. You're slightly shadowing me. That's okay. You just needed a glass. Fine. It was started by a couple of Americans called Jack and Jamie Davis. Now, I don't know if you've come across a wonderful sparkling wine in California called Framsberg, but that was created by Jack and Jamie Davis. And they came to Portugal one year and they had a look around the door and they said, hey, we could make really great sparkling wines here. No one had really thought of making sparkling wines. The story was all about port in those days. We're talking about 1989, so not that long ago. But it was still really all about port. There were table wines being made, but no one was really thinking of making sparkling wines. They thought, yeah, it's too hot, You sparkling wines, you need a cold climate, a place like Champagne, or maybe at the best, maybe somewhere like New Zealand or the cooler parts of the Napa Valley or Sonoma. But they started this company called Vertis, and from the very beginning, Celsu was the general manager, and he is still the general manager and one of the two winemakers. So he's been making wine ever since then. If you remember, I mentioned the Planalto de Aligean, which is in the center of the north part of the Douro Valley appellation, Aligean. And that's the place I said it's at between 500 and 700 meters of altitude. And that's where they decided. It was at that stage, it was very best known for white port. There were white vineyards, and there were vineyards not really for table wine, because for unfortified wine, because you didn't really make unfortified wine from whites then. I mean, it was all about port. But there were these old vineyards of white grapes, and that's where Celsu thought, well, I think I could make some pretty nice wine there. So high places and granite soils. You're off the schist there, and you're into the granite. So a cold soil, and this is what I love about this, as you can see here on the slide, this has had 6 years in bottle on the lees. It was disgorged last year. So that makes a huge difference in terms. Think of champagne. Champagne benefits enormously by being left on the lees for this wonderful transformation, this complexity to happen. So this has had 6 years. There are other wines that Celsu makes that have shorter times. He makes a lovely rosé, and he makes a particularly delicious rosé from Pinot Noir. But this one is, as I said, it's mainly Chardonnay with a little bit of Cuvée. Lovely sort of complex nose. Just a little hint of slightly mushroomy complexity. Lovely acidity. Toasty, slightly toasty. I think you see this is not a cheap wine. It's 33 euros the bottle. So they're not giving it away, but it is delicious. And it's a very good proof of the fact that you can make very good sparkling wine in the Douro Valley. There are more sparkling wines made in the region of Tavra Varosa, which is just to the south of the Douro Valley. It's the next region down to the south of the Douro. But I think that this Vertis, or particularly this one, which is the one I really enjoyed, I think because of this long aging it's had on the lees, this is tremendous wine. He also makes other Douro wines. There's a brand he has called Quanta Terra, which he makes with a different winemaker, whose name always escapes me. I can see him and I can't think what his name is. Jorge Alves. That's right, Jorge Alves, who is tall and it makes wine for various different people. But he and Celsu make this Quanta Terra together. Again, some lovely wines. And they have a Pinot Noir rosé, which is just fantastic. So Quanta Terra, worth looking out for. They have a lovely old building. Their main winery is relatively normal, but they have a beautiful old distillery building where they have a terrace on which you can sit out and taste the wines. And the interesting thing about this, it's an old distillery building, spirits warehouse really. And so they've got a museum space down below, and they've also got wonderful old tanks in which they used to keep the spirits, old concrete tanks. And in these concrete tanks, they don't have anything these days, but the action of the spirits on the concrete, they have got glass walls, and the action of the spirits on the concrete has made the most astonishing sort of completely random designs on the wall. So they use it as a gallery, as a museum. At the time I went there were a couple of people showing exhibits. But it's a lovely space. Okay, so let's move on from Quanta Terra and Vertis, our first wine, and move on to a wine from a company called Ramos Pinto. Next slide, please.
Wait. We have the first question coming in chat. What's
First
the best
question.
food pairing for this fresh wine?
What's the best food pairing for that fresh wine? Wow. You know, Catherine in the background is saying oysters. Now, I don't know whether you have lots of oysters in Poland.
Plenty of them.
Plenty of oysters.
Yeah.
I would go for it's going to be fish really, but it would be pretty good with smoked salmon. But I think things that go with champagne would do very well with this. You're against my light again, my sweet. Barring the light, I've suddenly gone dark. Okay, that's me. So yes, I think let's think champagne. What you drink with champagne, and that would be pretty good with this.
We drink caviar with champagne, you know.
You eat caviar with champagne. That's because you've got all sorts of caviar coming in from strange places.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Fine. But thank you very much. Thank you, Woods. Right, red grapes. So another load of. I'm moving on to this because from now on the wines are going to be red. There was one producer who said, "Look, I could offer you a red wine or a rosé wine or a white wine." But his red wine was so delicious, I thought, I'm afraid we're not going to have white wines or rosé wines in this tasting. You've had your white wine, and that was the sparkling one. So red grapes, again, here we are, again, totally Portuguese. The exception to that is I could say that maybe not just Portuguese, but Iberian, so Spain and Portugal. Touriga Francesa, Portugal, Touriga Nacional, Portugal, Tinta Orige, otherwise known as Aragonese, across the border, known as Tempranillo. So that's a great variety of the Spain and Portugal share. Tinta Barroca, Portugal, Tinta Pau, Portugal, Sozão, Spain and Portugal. More in Portugal than in Spain, but it does exist in Spain as well. In Portugal, its other name is Vinhão. It's used in Vinho Verde country to make red wines, very red wines, because they has very dark juice. Tinta Amarela, Portugal. So you see, these are Portuguese grapes. The first five, Touriga Francesa, Touriga Nacional, Tinta Orige, Barroca, and Cao, these were chosen after some very thorough experiments. I'll talk about that when we get to it, perhaps. Chosen in the late 1980s, I think, as part of a program financed by the World Bank. And Portugal wanted to help the relatively impoverished area of the Douro do more plantation, make more wine, give more work to the people who lived there. And so there was this project set up. And the five grapes chosen were Touriga Francesa, Touriga Nacional, Tinta Orige, Tinta Barroca, and Tinta Cao. I'll speak more about them as we come to them. Sozão, we're not going to see very much of today, but I'm hoping that at some stage in the not too far distant future, we may do another of these presentations with Vinho Verde wines, and we will certainly show a Sozão or two there. Tinta Amarela, also widely grown in the Alentejo, where it's called Trincadeira. This is a problem in Portugal, really, because you've got all these wonderful Portuguese grapes, but very often you have the same grapes in different places with different names, which doesn't make people who are not entirely familiar with them any easier. Okay, move on to the next one. Next slide. Ramos Pinto. Ramos Pinto. I'm just giving you a pic there. It's a lovely. It's of a picture of the part of a balcony of a beautiful quinta called the Quinta de Bom Retiro, which is not far from Pinhão, in the center of the sort of main port area of the Douro Valley. It's not one of the quintas from which the grapes here come, because they come. Let's turn on to the next slide, please. They come from two other quintas. It's the actual next slide, please. The next one is called Duas Quintas. That means two estates, two quintas, two farms, two estates. And these two quintas are, they're both in the Douro Superior, Erva Moira, and which is a schist quinta, and Bonsarish, which is much higher and which is granite and sand. So between the two of them, they make a very complementary blend, because Erva Moira is relatively low. It's quite easy to cultivate. A lot of Erva Moira is planted in rows. It's got a bit of a slope, but it's not too difficult to slope. It's on schist soil, so it's a warmer soil, and it's in the Douro Valley. It's not that high. Erva Moira which is quite a big. It's got 223 hectares, altitudes 110 to 340 meters. Bonsarish is smaller, 47 hectares, but it's up at 600 meters. So it's much cooler, and it has those granite soils. So between the two of them, you've got this lovely blend of warmth and richness and ripeness from Erva Moira. And Ramos Pinto makes a very good single vineyard wine from Erva Moira, which sells for quite a lot of money. But it also makes this wine in both white and red, Duas Quintas, with grapes from these two different quintas. What can I say? There is an important point to make, is that it's actually owned by the Champagne Louis Roederer family. It was bought in 1990, I think, but it's still run 100% by the same Portuguese family to whom it used to belong, which is the current CEO is a guy called Jorge Rosas, and the CEO before was João Nicolau de Almeida. And those two families have always owned, and until recently owned and run. But so it's now completely owned by Champagne Roederer, but it's still run by the Portuguese families that used to own it. Talking about those Portuguese families, those were the two families, the Rosas family and the Nicolau de Almeida family. Sorry, lost it for a moment. The Nicolau de Almeida family, who did that research into those grapes that were most suitable for plantation in the Douro. It was João Nicolau de Almeida, the recently retired CEO of Ramos Pinto, and I think it was his uncle, who was called Antonio Rosas, and they did the research into this, and it was they who came up with these 5 different grapes. Right. Where is my sorry, just been hidden from me. Duas Quintas. There we are. Okay. So Duas Quintas, you can see the blend there. Mostly Touriga Nacional, 51%. Touriga Franca, 26%. Tinta Roriz, and Tinta Barroca and Sozao, and Tinta Cao, and Tinta Amarela, Tinta de Barca. You know, another of these sort of really rare and not very much planted, but it's in there in the blend. That's in a bit of old vines. So fermented in granite lagars. I mean, when I say fermented in granite lagars, that means foot trodden, or in me light again. Foot trodden, and then transferred to large oak vats. And my computer suddenly turned itself off. There we are, back again. Yes, and then 12 months in oak or in stainless steel. So this is a relatively affordable at 16 euros. The trouble with Ramos Pinto is that the wines are so good, and it's not a huge company, they tend to run out. And so there were quite a lot of the wines that I might have liked to use that they said, oh, sorry, no, we seem to have run out of that. Shelf price you can see there is 16 euros. Shelf price is always on the screen.
Yeah. And another question is a storage potential for this.
Storage, you know, I tasted this before we started just to make sure that all the wines were in good shape and that there weren't any corked bottles. And I thought, wow, this is quite firm at the moment. This ages incredibly well. For me, this is a little bit on the young stage at the moment. And I think this will benefit from being, if you could bear to, leave it in bottle for another 2 or 3 years, just to sort of soften off a little bit. But it's got lovely, fresh, lovely, it's this beautiful Douro fruit. Mm. Quite firm still. This is, I'm afraid, one of the functions of the fact that they sell their wines so well. This is the 2021. They have been holding back a little bit of older wine to offer to a market that is, that appreciates older wines. But I'm afraid that one, which was the 2014, it's gone. I said, "Oh, could we use that in the tasting?" And they said, "Sorry, it's already been sold." Anyway, move on to the next. I thought that it's got a lovely, just this wonderful sort of perfumed Touriga fruit, lovely wine, and it will keep. Okay, next wine. Wine and Soul is the name of the company, and a very appealing pair of winemakers. There you are, Georges and Sandra. Georges just popped in at the end. Photo taken by Catherine on their balcony, which is why, unfortunately, it's not perfect for the placing of the sun. But it's Georges Sorodio Borges from the Borges Port family originally, and Sandra Tavares de Silva, whose family have an estate in the Lisboa region called Quinta de Chocapalha, where she is the winemaker and she makes very good wine. They're both winemakers. They're one of the sort of star winemaker pairs in the Douro Valley. I still think of them as being incredibly young. They're less young than they were, but they're still sort of young stars of the Douro Valley. Okay, let's move on to the next shot, because that is the shot of Quinta de Manuela, where this wine comes from. Now, Quinta de Manuela, when they first got together, Georges and Sandra, they got together, they were both winemakers, and they were working. They were actually both working in the Douro with Dirk Niepoort, and they were both working there. And actually, no, Sandra, I think, was working at Quinta Valdon Maria, but they met at some party, and 2 years later they were married. They bought a winery. They didn't have any vineyards to start with, and then they started getting vineyards together. That was the winery purchase was in 2001. So they've been going just over 20 years. And in a village called Valmendige, and on a hillside, and that's where that first picture was taken on their balcony. This is Quinta de Manuela, which they bought later. They bought it later, and it was a quinta which had been in the Borges family, but they needed to buy it. What they loved about it was that while Valmendige is very schist, it's really quite warm, even though the river Pinhal flows through it. It's quite hot there in summer. This lovely Quinta de Manuela, although you can't see it in this picture, if you go sort of in that direction from this picture, you get into forest. So part of this vineyard is forest. Again, it's got the river that runs through it, and it makes a huge difference because you get this valley with the beautiful vines and freshness from the forest that's all around. Very old vines. You see these lovely old stone walls. This is a very old vineyard, and with very deep-rooted vines. And it's just in the heat of the summer, the coolness that you get, not in that vineyard there, but the coolness around about when you get when you get the shadows of evening coming in, and the sort of cool of the forest sort of starts to cool everything down. And it means that you get an extraordinary freshness in these wines. Okay, let's move on to the next shot, because there we're back in Valmendige. So this is the little town where they have their winery. Actually, they've got a second winery now near Manuela. But this one, again, a wonderful view over the Douro Valley. And that's the balcony above their winery in Val de Mendige. And the next shot, please, is, I think, going to be, here we are. Here are the details about the wine. So this is a wine that it's I think one of their less expensive wines, 22 years of alcohol, but it's still one of the less expensive ones. It's 60% Touriga Nacional, 25 Touriga Franca, and Tinta Orige, Tinta Francisca. Here's another one. Tinta Francisca is a very pale-skinned variety, which again, it has a lot of acidity, and it's really helpful to bring freshness to a blend. So this is quite a traditionally made wine, foot throttled for 12 hours in stone lagars, and then it goes into stainless steel and it's temperature controlled. Then 16 months in used oak barrels. They don't want the flavor of new oak in this. They want it used oak barrels. So they started off with the winery in Val de Mendige, and they named their wine Pintas, which means spots, because during the vintage, you're probably wearing a white t-shirt, and it gets covered in spots of red wine from the juice that sprays around all over the place. Let's just have a. So think of a place which is cool in summer, even though the vines all around are blazing in heat, but you've got these cool, and I say forest, I mean, I'm talking all sorts of different kinds of trees. Freshness, cool. I think that's a delicious wine. It's got this freshness. It's got this cool. Pintas is a bigger wine made in around Val de Mendige. The vineyards all come from around Val de Mendige, whereas Quinta Manuela, it's a quinta, and they also make some very good white wines from a bit further north on that sort of granite plateau. There's a wonderful one called Guru, which is a Douro white made by George and Sandra. I see another question has come in. Are there many foreign non-Portuguese winemakers? Well, yeah, there are a few. Not many, because, but you know, if you've got lots of money and can afford the prices, you can probably manage to buy your way in. Not many, but I mean, you know, as I said, Champagne Rodera owns Ramos Pinto. There is another wine we're going to be having, which actually is a cooperation between one of the Portuguese companies or British Portuguese companies and another, a French winemaker. But yeah, there are a few people who are making wine, but not that many. And some of them have sort of almost gone native, and so they're almost, you know, perfectly Portuguese. I mean, there's another winery called Quinta do Tejo, which is owned by an American couple. Actually, he's French and she's American. So there are a few foreign winemakers in Douro. Are women winemakers appearing in bigger numbers? Yes, frankly. There are some excellent women making wine, excellent winemakers.
Sandra Tavares, for example.
Sandra, for instance. Sandra is she's a really good winemaker. And yes, I would say probably the men still outnumber the women, but there are some really, really talented women winemakers. He was standing in my light again. Anyway, so Wine and Soul, they have these two separate operations. There's Manuela, which they bought in 2009, having bought the winery in Val de Mendige in 2001. So again, you know, it's only just over 20 years that they've been making wines together, but they are very definitely among the stars. They sell. Sandra was telling me they sell in Poland with a company called Mierzynski. Does that ring bells? So that they do have an outlet for their wines in Poland.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. And but
Yeah.
their white wines, the Guru white and Manuela white, they're lovely wines. They've got another high altitude white wine called Altar. George's uncle had always dreamed of making white wines from his high altitude vineyards, but he couldn't do it, and he couldn't find the right name. The name of the vineyard was called Vigna Grande, but that name was already taken by another large wine company, so they had to think of something. So he thought, what can I call it? Altar. So you have this combination of highness, height from altitude, altar, and that's a delicious wine as well. Anyway, so and then you get onto the Pintish, which is their top wine from Valdemendige, and then the Manuela Viniferisch Tinto, which is just an astonishing wine. It's their top old vine wine from Quinta Manuela, and they're also starting to make port now. This isn't really a tasting about port, but it has to be made. Point has to be made that there is a lot of port still made in the Douro Valley and made very well, and it still accounts for quite a high proportion of the wine sold from the Douro Valley, the grapes grown in the Douro Valley. So Celsu doesn't make port, but then where have we been? We've been Ramos Pinto, they make port. Georges and Sandra have started to make port. They started on Douro Dock unfortified wines, but they've now moved towards port. Now, I'm just not quite sure. I think yes, that must be, I'm just trying to think what I've got in my glass now. I think I've still got Manuela. Oh, God. I hate to put this into my spittoon, but there it has to go. Sad. Quinta Manuela, that's the dust. A lovely, fresh, graceful, elegant wine. Okay, Quinta de la Rosa. Quinta de la Rosa, they also make port, but they make wine as well. This is Quinta de la Rosa, which, as you see, is right on the side of the Douro Valley. It's owned by a family called Bergqvist. Sophia Bergqvist is the CEO. Bergqvist, not an obviously Portuguese name, I may hear you thinking. I think the Bergqvist family originally came from, Catherine is saying Sweden, I was thinking Denmark, but she's probably right. But anyway, it's a Scandinavian country, but they've been in Portugal for quite long. It was Sophia's dad. It was her grandfather, I think, who first came to Quinta La Rosa. And there it is. You see, it's they're thinking of building another vineyard because they've also got vineyards not only here, which is very close to Pinhal, one of the great centers of winemaking in the Douro Valley, but also they've got one in the Douro Superior way up east, and they're thinking of building another winery there. Here's a picture of the terrace of the restaurant. So we're looking from from the other side of the valley now, looking across, and that's the restaurant. And there has been a huge change at Quinta de la Rosa and we stayed there for a couple of nights in very comfortable rooms, beautifully appointed. I would really thoroughly recommend it as a place to stay for anyone who wanted to. Delicious breakfast. I mean, the food here in the restaurant, in both at breakfast and also for the other meals of the day, is astonishing. It's really fine dining, and that is a big change from when I first went to Quinta de la Rosa. They've got a very, very good chef there now, and they are making incredibly good food. And the most important thing is that they used to just about cope. They'd make a living out of making their wines, their ports, their Douro wines. They're now making much more wine out of the tourism offer, the rooms, the restaurant. They've got two restaurants, actually. One is more of a sort of informal, and then there's that one we had the picture of, which is really fine dining. The food we had there was just fantastic. And this is something which has really happened in the Douro. It's suddenly the offering for people wanting to come and visit the Douro is much better than it used to be. It used to be, if you wanted to find somewhere to stay, you were struggling. There were a couple of hotels in Regua, but weren't many hotels other places. Now there are lots of places that do turismo rural, sort of rural tourism. And there are some very high quality small hotels or places like Quinta de la Rosa, which have really wonderful rooms to stay in and brilliant food. Anyway, back to the wine. Here we have the straightforward Douro Tinto, La Rosa Tinto. Again, Touriga Nacional predominantly, Touriga Franca, bearing it up with 30%, and then 5% each of Tinto Roriz and Sauzin. Altitude is between 150 to 500 meters. You see, so there is a big difference in the altitude between what's down, the grapes down near the river, and the grapes right up at the top of the slopes. And remember that figure of you lose a degree of average temperature every 100 meters you go up. So it makes a really big difference. And then 12 months in French oak barrels, of which 40% are new. This is this to me, that really, I'm really smelling that Touriga Nacional. Touriga Nacional, backed up by Touriga Franca. It's a grape variety that has this astonishing perfume, which I think is coming through really well in this wine. It's something to do with, it's almost the skin of bergamot citrus. It's got herbs in there. It's just a complex, perfumed, slightly leafy. It's just, I think, delicious. It's one of my favorite grape varieties. I think, I'm pretty fond of Pinot Noir, but Touriga Nacional can make some wonderful wines. There are winemakers, Dirk Nieport, who is not one of the wines who's one of the winemakers whose grapes we're featuring, but a very good winemaker in the Douro Valley. Mostly he makes wine in other places as well. He doesn't like Touriga Nacional because he finds in a blend it takes over. It's just too dominant, but I just love this perfume. Mm. Mm. Nice tannins, not too firm, not too extracted, gentle, supportive tannins. And, it's a couple of years old now, 2020. So it would have been picked in August, September. And it's got length. It's got this lovely perfumed length, which I find bewitching. So delicious wine. But please, if ever you're thinking of going to the Douro Valley, there are some lovely hotels. There are lovely places where you can stay. But if you can get yourself booked into De La Rosa for a night, have a meal there, or you didn't have a meal there, but the rooms are lovely. You will have an unforgettable time. It's beautiful, and the food is tremendous. Okay, let's move on. Gosh, we only got to wine number 4. Goodness. Right.
Beautiful balance.
Piotr, what you saying?
There's a comment in chat.
Yeah, beautifully balanced wine.
Eva.
Good. Thank you. I absolutely agree with you. I think it's got lovely balance, lovely perfume, beautiful balance. And it's a wine that it won't sort of disappear. It won't fall over. It will continue on for a few years. Right. So now we're moving on. Now, Nicolau d'Almeida. This is the family that used to own Ramos Pinto and sold it to Champagne Roederer. And they reinvested in this quinta here. And it's called Quinta de Montexisto. There's the name, Montexisto. It's right up in the Douro Superior. And the family sold Ramos Pinto in 1990. And João Nicolau d'Almeida, who was the ex-CEO before he retired, and that's João's son, Mateus, one of his sons. He then reinvested to buy Quinta de Monte Xisto in 1993. So he reinvested pretty quickly. It was a bit smaller then than it is now. Had old vines, old terraces, not terraces, patamages, these sort of earth slopes between the rows. And there you see, that's the typical kind of soil that they have at Monte Xisto. It's rock. That's schist rock. It's a pale colored schist. It was a picture taken. It was the last visit in the day, and so the shadows are beginning to creep over the valley. But that just gives you an idea of the kind of ground that these vines have to be planted in. Yes, of course, it has to be broken up. In the old days, they'd do it with dynamite. Nowadays, you can use earth-moving machines to break up the rock. But that is what the vines are planted in. It's rock. It's rock. It's broken up rock, but it's still rock. Okay, let's have a look at the figures here. So this is a wine called Orbita, because there is a sort of ring of vineyards that goes round the slopes of the vineyard. It's all completely organic, farmed completely organically. It's 65 hectares of land, mid-slope, so it's not too high, not too low. Planted 18 years ago in 2005. Now they're planting a bit more. And what is quite interesting about the planting is that they're planting at a much higher density than most places in the Douro Valley, at 10,000 plants per hectare. The normal is about 4,000 plants per hectare. But in order to get enough yield out of that kind of, very, very sort of sparsely planted vineyard, you have to have a lot of land. So they've got a smaller amount of land, but they are planting more densely, and they are going to get a bit more wine out of it than they would otherwise do. They're experimenting with 6,000 or 7,000 just to see if that works better than this 10,000 that they have been planting at. The other thing they're doing is that they're planting some of the vines in bush vines, as bush vines, not training them. Theoretically, that's illegal, but that doesn't really make sense because one of the things that bush vines can give a vine in a very hot summer climate, like you get heat in the summer in the Douro Superior, it can give more shade, it can give more leaf shade. And that's terribly important because if in a really hot summer, sometimes the leaves wither and the vines can actually get sunburn. It seems silly, but I mean it's true. You can get sunburnt wines if the leaves sort of shrivel and wither, and you just need just a bit more leaf cover to keep the vines fresh and keep the acidity there. So Orbita, this is concrete tank, mostly Touriga Nacional. The rest of it's old vines. So some of the old vines that they bought, the Touriga Nacional, there's the new Touriga. Oh my goodness me, that perfume. Do you see what I mean about this perfume? We're getting close to Solo Touriga Nacional now. And this to me, this is this perfume. This lovely sort of bergamot, herby perfume that you get from Touriga Nacional. It's interesting because Touriga Nacional, as some of you may know, has recently been, they've got experimental plantations in Bordeaux because the Bordelais have realized quite sensibly that they're living in a changing climate. The temperatures are going up. And so they have decided to experiment with various grapes grown in hotter places, like, for instance, Portugal. And Touriga Nacional is one of the grapes that has been chosen, as is Alvarinho for whites. There are various other grapes, mostly from the south of France, that are in this experimental study. But before long, we may be seeing Touriga Nacional appearing in Bordeaux vineyards, which previously was unthinkable. I'm not quite sure what they're going to do in Burgundy, though, because Burgundy relies on its balance, its precision, its elegance. Pinot Noir is not a great grape for a hot climate. If the climate gets higher and higher and higher in Burgundy, I'm not quite sure what the Burgundians are going to do. Stock up on old vintages of Burgundy, I suppose. But this has this bewitching perfume. I love this. They also showed me it's a bit more Touriga Nacional at the moment. They're going to take it down to about 50% of the blend in future, and the rest mixed. Fermented in concrete tanks, very soft extraction, and then aged in a mixture of concrete and old wooden vats. So you're really getting the sense of the wine here. You've not got an awful lot of not got a lot of oak sort of cluttering up the flavour. This is just a wonderful sense of Touriga Nacional. What would I drink with Touriga Nacional? Gosh, I'm afraid I'm still a meat eater. Although my wife and I, we eat more vegetables than we do meat, and we both love fish and seafood. But I think for me, with Touriga Nacional, probably my first choice would be really good beef. It would go very well with some aged cheeses, hard cheese. Good, in English terms, I'm talking sort of fine cheddar. There are some lovely sheep's cheeses here in Portugal, which the hard sheep's cheeses, that would be a pretty good partner for this. But just this perfume, it's the kind of wine that invites you just to drink it. Who needs food? Anyway, this is probably a bad idea, and we'd all fall over if we didn't have food as well. They make port as well. They're beginning to make port, and they showed us two of their ports actually, a white port and another one. And I think it's going to be very good, but they're concentrating on the Douro dock wines for the moment. I've been smelling this for so long I haven't dared taste it, but for fear of. I think that's beautiful. Length, perfume, just delicious wine. And I'm afraid that Monchichtu, the Nicolau d'Almeida, it's quite a small company. So there's not an awful lot. And they charge fair but quite high prices. I think one thing, you may well have met all sorts of wines from Portugal in your Polish wine experience. And of course, one of the big links between Portugal and Poland is the Biedronka chain of discounters. The link is because the family that owns Biedronka also owns a Portuguese supermarket chain called Pingo Doce. And so, but Biedronka, I think, really concentrates on inexpensive wines. And as ever with these tastings, what we're trying to show you here are rather more expensive wines, just showing what you can get when you go up in price a little bit. And that, I think, is a wonderful example. Okay, let's move on. I'm loath to throw this away, but there we are. Can't drink everything. My love, you better start pouring less wine into the glass, then we throw less away. Okay, Lavradores de Feitoria. Really interesting company. There you are. That is their modern winery. Until recently, it's a small scale cooperative. They started in August 2000 with 15 members. Lost one, others joined. They now have, I think, 33. And we'll have a picture of all of them later. Going back to that last pic, yeah, that's the 33. Go back to 2 slides, would you? There you are. So this is the new winery that they built in 2021, because they were in a sort of industrial building. I remember going there. It was not beautiful. And they decided they needed to have a better winery to reflect the beauty of their surroundings. They're in the Alijó plateau, this high granite plateau. And they thought they should have somewhere which was worthy. So downstairs, as you can see, looking through, they have their barrel cellar. And upstairs, they have more of the winery and some of the tourism aspects. And so there is a long tasting table, which we tasted at. Okay, let's move on one then. And here you have the two main players, Paulo Rual, who is the chief winemaker, and Olga Martins, who is the CEO. She was, I think, the sales director, and she moved up. I can't remember who the CEO used to be, but Olga is now the CEO. So Paulo and Olga, they are the people who are principally responsible for the wines, as well as the next slide, all these folk who are the shareholders of Lavradores de Feitoria, many of whom own vineyards, not all of them. And there's Olga in the middle, sort of below the head of the dog. And where's Paulo? He's somewhere. Not sure. He's in there somewhere. But this is the happy band of investors in Lavradores de Feitoria. They have 3 levels of wine. I think that you see the basic level, which is just called Lavradores. You see that already in Poland a bit. But then you get another level called Trzeź Baguś. Lavradores de Feitoria is the basic level. That comes to Poland. Trzeź Baguś is the next level up. And then you get the single estate wines. We are going to taste one called Marouge. Now, Marouge, I mean, I was slightly puzzled when I saw this because I have no idea what is Marouge. Is it a place? What is it? It isn't a place. There you are, Marouge Tinto. And there it is proudly on the label. Marouge it's a kind of micro salad leaf. It's probably not. We have some micro salad in our garden, which just grows there. I mean, it's not something we planted. It's called Beldroega. The French would call it pourpier, and it just grows there naturally. It's wild. And I don't know whether Marouge grows wild or whether it has to be planted. But it's a leaf. It's sometimes called, what's it called? It's otherwise known as San Martino, or sometimes water chickweed. So there you are. It's a kind of it's not a place. It's a small leafy plant. Anyway, this is Tinto Orige. So one of the Spanish, one of the French, one of the Portuguese names for Tempranillo, Tinto Orige tends to be the name used in the north of Portugal, whereas in the south of Portugal they call it Aragonês. Same grape, 2 totally different names. But 80% of Tinto Orige, with a bit of Touriga Nassau, a bit of Touriga Franca, and some old vines in the blend as well. Foot trodden again with the stems in the lagars. So they're looking for real ripeness in the stems, because otherwise you would have some very stern tannins. And then fermented in oak barrels, and then aged in those French oak barrels for 14 months. Now, we poured this out just to make sure the cork was okay. And Catherine immediately said, "Oh, this smells like really good red Burgundy." And it's mainly Tempranillo, don't forget, but it's just got this lovely, gentle, elegant red fruit. There's a little bit of oak in there, but it's got this lovely red fruit, soft, fragrant character, which I have to say, I agree. It does remind me a little bit of red Burgundy. The actual vineyard this comes from, I've never been there, but it is apparently, I'm just trying to look up and see from my notes where they said it is. It's very close to Quinta de Bom Retiro. Do you remember that picture of the balcony, of the column on a balcony that we saw quite early on in the presentation at Quinta de Bom Retiro, the Ramos Pinto, one of the Ramos Pinto quintas? It's very close to that. So it's in the valley of the river Tortu, which is one of the tributaries of the Douro, and quite high up. And I can imagine that this has to come from a higher place. It's sort of finer. It's more elegant. It doesn't seem like a place from the hot areas down close by the river. Mm. still got a bit of oak showing, but it's just got this lovely, elegant freshness to it. 14.5% doesn't seem like 14.5%. You could have fooled me, as they say, but delicious, fresh, fragrant, and mostly what the Spanish would call Tempranillo, Tinto Roriz, in the north of Portugal. So this is one of the wines they make. I tasted some of the others. I also tasted another single variety one called Quinta de Costa. And I thought, oh, another, mostly Touriga Nacional, quite near crash to that vineyard where we saw that first picture of that beautiful autumn vineyard with the swimming pool in the far distance above the Douro. But they've obviously worked, I think Paulo, the winemaker, has worked really hard to extract what he wants to extract, but not taking too much. I remember talking to him, he said, we take it out, take it off the skins when we judge by taste that the time is right. And you know, they are very careful about extraction. They're tasting the wines 2 or 3 times a day, and they take it off the skins just at the right moment, and no skins are in the barrels. I think lovely wine. Again, it's another expression of Douro wine. And I think that's one of the things that I find most bewitching about the Douro. Not only is it a magical river with wonderful wines made up and down the entire length of it, but there are so many different expressions of the Douro. There are so many different grape varieties to use, different exposures, different, just valleys facing in different directions. I'm loath to pour this away, but luckily Catherine didn't give me too much in the first place. So there might be time to have another glass later. Beautiful long finish, yes.
2 comments,
not
yes.
overwhelming. I agree. Interesting light wine, yes, absolutely. It's elegant, it's fresh, it's light. I think that's because it's from a higher place, and it's been beautifully managed in the winery. Because I could imagine a wine like that could be really sort of big, and I think that one of the things he said was that when they first made this wine, the tannins were terrifying, and they thought, oh, whoops, we've got this wrong. We've got to work more gently with this. And I think they've now got to the point where they are making this lovely, fragrant, gentle wine. And I think give it a little bit of time, a bit more time for that oak to slightly quieten down. And I think it will be an utterly bewitching wine. Okay, wine number 7. We're halfway through, folks. How are we doing on time? We're doing okay, yeah. Right, halfway through. Real Company Avelia. Now, this is a fascinating company because Real, of course, is the Portuguese word for royal. It's the old company that was originally started by the Portuguese kings, and it's passed through various different sets of hands. But for the last 3 generations, it has been in the hands of the Silva Reis family. So I was that is one of their quintas. It's called the Quinta de Cidro, and it's in the Upper Douro, but it's quite high. It's the biggest. They say the Silva Reis, Pedro Silva Reis Jr., who is the guy who received us. He's, as I said, the 3rd generation of the Silva Reis family. This is Quinta de Cidro. Again, you can see vineyards away from the picture, but then you've got this formal garden in front of this very impressive house. I was going to say chateau, but I mean, it gives you that impression. So this formal garden with stones making patterns here, and these very formal bushes in the front, which are slightly in shadow. It's their picture, so it's not my shadow, it's their shadow. But those are the formal gardens of Quinta de Cidro. And then the next picture shows you me about to have dinner. There I am sitting, waiting for some food and tasting more wines. And that in the center is Pedro Silva Reis Jr., who was the guy who very kindly received us and gave us a huge wine tasting and gave us dinner. And the lady who was helping with the food and the wine. So we're sitting in the kitchen of a different quinta. We didn't go to Cidro on this occasion, although Catherine and I had been there before. We went to a quinta called Quinta dos Carvalhos, the Quinta of the Oaks. I didn't see many oaks there now. Maybe they used to have oaks there, which is just opposite Pinhal, on top of quite an impressive hill. And the Quinta dos Carvalhos is a very, very impressive place indeed. It's beautifully farmed. They have really wonderful walls, beautifully crafted stone walls. The vineyards seem to be meticulously cared for. We had a long chat with one of the two people who's been looking after the vineyards. Actually, I think Alvaro is called. Alvaro, who's now been working in this vineyard, Alvaro Lopes. He started working at Carvalhos when he was 25 and he's now 50. So he's been working there for 25 years and he's doing pretty well. But it's a fascinating story, the story of Real Company Velha. So it was bought by this guy, Pedro's grandfather, who was called Manuel Silvereis, and he bought it. There's a really good website on I really thoroughly recommend you look at the Real Company Velha website, because it's got a very good timeline of all the things that happened to Real Company Velha. Sometimes it just says, 1977, very good vintage for port. But there are an awful lot of other things telling the story of how it moved from being owned by the royal family. And Real Company Velha in the old days, they were the people who made the rules for port. We weren't thinking about unfortified wines in those days because unfortified wines weren't really part of the equation as far as commerce in wine from the Douro Valley was concerned. But they made the rules for port, and there are all sorts of times when they had to tighten the rules because wine was coming in from different areas. There were suggestions that wines were being adulterated with other things occasionally. They were the rule makers in the early days. And eventually it became a commercial company. It was founded, the original Rail Company of Velha, in 1756. So it was Manuel Silvereis who bought it, 1921, he was born in 1921. And he started working in port houses, just washing out tanks and things, and eventually became a port agent for in Sweden and Holland. He became consul for Portugal in Sweden. Back in Portugal, he bought Carvalhos, this wonderful place, quinta opposite Pinhal, where we had dinner. Bought it in 1953, and then bought the company, Royal Company of Velha, in 1960. But they had good stocks of wine then, so he didn't lack for wine. There was a lot of wine still in tanks. And then bought the other quintas, Quinta de Chaches Prestes, Quinta Casal de Granjo, and then Quinta de Cidro eventually. So Carvalhos is very much for Portuguese grapes, all sorts of different kinds. Cidro, there was an interesting moment because they got a California winemaking director in there called Jerry Luper. And I remember meeting him once many years ago. And Jerry came from California and he was very keen. He said, look, you've got wonderful vineyards here. You could be growing Cabernet Sauvignon. You could be growing Chardonnay. All these wonderful grapes we have in California. And so he planted Chardonnay. He planted Cabernet Sauvignon. Chardonnay actually worked pretty well because Cidro is quite high. It's schist, but it's high and cool. And so the Quinta Cidro Chardonnay is pretty successful, still successful. But the Touriga Nacional now is what we're tasting. And this, again, this is this great grape. It's got a bit more sort of richness and fullness, less of that lovely perfume that some of the early ones have, but more body. This is just made in stainless steel, and then it gets some aging in French oak barrels, of which 20% are new. So you wouldn't expect to be too marked by the oak. There's just a little sort of whisper of oak in there. Ooh. good tannins, but quite firm. They've got this. I selected one of the wines from Quinta dos Carvalhos first at their tasting, and it said it's one. It was their old vine blend, Vinhas Velhas, old vines, and I said, oh, this is a fabulous wine, and it is a fabulous wine. But then Pedro Jr. got in touch and said, look, we don't have this available in Portugal, but we do have the Cidro Touriga Nacional. So we'd prefer to show that. And I looked back at my notes and I saw that I really liked the Cidro Touriga Nacional. And so we've gone with this one. They have done so much experiment, mainly at Quinta dos Carvalhos, with Portuguese varieties. And I tasted a bewildering number when we had that evening with them. Things like, what was it he showed us? He showed us wines that I really hardly heard. He showed us one called Cornifestu, Douro grape variety, grown in Quinta dos Carvalhos. Didn't particularly strike me as being wonderful. There was a white wine called San Marinho, almost like Riesling. Fascinating wine. I mean, really interesting. Then they showed a Tinta Francisca. Tinta Francisca, this, I think I've referred to it before with Quinta Manuela. Quite high acid, very fresh, very pale skinned. They showed a Bastardo, which actually tasted really quite like Pinot Noir. Real fascinating variety of different grapes. So not only do they have these two quintas, the Quinta dos Carvalhos and Quinta de Cidro, but they've got this Acipreste in the middle of the Douro Valley, and then their biggest vineyard is the one near Alijó, which is the we didn't actually have any wines from there, I think, at all, but that's about 500 hectares, and it's a huge. And Pedro was very proud of the fact. He said, "Look, we are the largest single owner of vineyard in the Douro Valley." And I thought to myself, well, what about the Symingtons, the Symington family, one of whose wines we're going to have later? And he said, yeah, well, the Symingtons actually have, in total, they have over 1,000 hectares, whereas we have 500 something. But they're all, it's different Symingtons who own them. Whereas we, as one company, we own all this vineyard. So yes, the Symingtons in total have the largest amount of vineyard in the Douro Valley. But Real Companhia Velha has the greatest amount of vineyard owned by a single producer. And what they're doing in terms of experiment with the old, lesser-known varieties, as well as what they've been doing over the years for in Cidro with things like Chardonnay. And the Chardonnay is lovely. It's really good. They got Valvarinho grown in both in Carvalhos and in Cidro. Lovely white wines. And their winemaker now, Jerry Lupa, was there, I think, until 2006. Their winemaker for the last few years has been Jorge Moreira, whose wine we are going to taste a little later, who is, again, one of these really, really talented, young-ish winemakers in the Douro Valley. Okay, so that's Real Companhia Velha.
Yeah, Charles, we have to speed up a little, as if you want to finish by 6:30, we have 1 minute and still 5 wines. Yeah. So
sorry, I thought we were going for it. I thought we were going for a slightly later finish, but we can certainly.
And guys, do not forget to take some photos.
Oh yes, take photos. We need to have pictures. Right, we're now moving on to another wine. This is the one that comes from the Symington family. Catherine has been making notes from the books we've written about matching food with wine, which is helpful. And she's saying, as I suggested, with Touriga Nacional, the 3-star match is beef. But she's got all sorts of things. Calf's liver, very good. Red cabbage, cooked red cabbage. And then as far as herbs, cheddar cheese, as I said, And it's beef for Touriga Nacional. Very good chorizo, lovely with partridge. Pheasant, another very good. I don't know if you have many pheasants in Poland, but duck is pretty good, or smoked duck. All sorts of suggestions here for partners for Touriga Nacional. And as an extraordinary sort of pairing with a particular spice, cardamom is a spice that goes really well with beef. Sorry, with beef, with Touriga Nacional. Now this, I think, must be the last wine, so I'm going to empty that in my spittoon and have some of this postscriptum from Pratt's and Symington. So that is the Quinta. Now, the Symingtons are the family. It's originally a Scottish family, but they've lived in Portugal for many generations. They live in Portugal. They tend to send their sons and daughters to school in England and then bring them back to Portugal. So I think there are 5 current members of cousins and brothers of who run the company at the moment, with the next generation coming on fast. So this is a company called Pratt's and Symington. Why Pratt's? Because we talked earlier about foreign influence in the Douro Valley. Pratt's is a company, Bruno Pratt's, very distinguished winemaker in Bordeaux. That is Pedro Correa, who is the winemaker for all the unfortified wines within the Symington group. Bruno Pratt's owned for Chateau Coste-d'Estournel for quite a long time. His son Guillaume has also been very impressive, a very important owner. Now owns the Delon family, including Chateau Léoville-Lascaz. That's Guillaume, Bruno's. But Bruno is still involved in wine. And Bruno and the Symingtons brought together this Quinta de Roriz, that was the picture we saw one photo back. And so they now make wine. And they were one of the first companies really to have a strong French influence, or the French way of doing things rather than the Portuguese way. So you'll see the shape of those tanks. There's what the French would call, on the left-hand side, they call them tronco conique, because they're sort of conically shaped but upended. And it's very easy to get some good maceration on the skins and then empty them out through the bottoms. So this, let's move on to the next slide, please. Pratt's and Symington, this is postscriptum. So P&S, Pratt's and Symington, the top wine is called Chrysaea, which is a transliteration of the Greek word for golden, because there you have this play on words, because Douro, which is the name of the valley, the river. Douro also in Portugal could mean of gold. So Chrysaea is a word which means gold. PS postscriptum, so it's their second wine, but taking the initials of the 2 families, the Pratts and the Symingtons. And again, they are very keen on the 2 Tourigas, Touriga Nacional, Touriga Franca. Bruno always comes over before vintage. He spends some time at vintage as well. I'm told that they've got a wine in Poland at the moment, the Symingtons. It's one of their Altanu wines. I think it's in Biedronka. They have, but they're one of the great port families. This Quinta de Roriz used to belong to the Van Zeller family, and then part of it was bought by the Symingtons, and then it now is owned by the Pratts and Symington families. But other famous port names that you'd expect that you'd be familiar with from the Symingtons: Graham's, Dow's, Wars, what's the other? Coburn's. Those are the 4 famous names, and there are all sorts of other smaller, slightly less well-known names, but making incredibly good ports. But they have gone headfirst into unfortified wines, and they have very good small wineries all over the Douro, and then one massive one called Quinta do Sol, which is opposite. It's on the south bank. It's a very discreet entrance. I've driven past it many times without realizing it was there. But then you drive in through the entrance, and you have this huge winery with lots of stainless steel tanks, where they make a lot of their wines. Anyway, this is the small scale French influenced style. Again, mostly Touriga Nacional with some Touriga Franca there as well. It's riverfront, and it's very much a focus on these two grapes. There is a little bit of Barocca, there's a bit of Tintucal, there's a bit of Rorige, Tinto Rorige, but it's very low yielding Touriga Nacional, which makes most of the wine here. And they have a special winery to produce the Crisea, and then the second wine is this one here, the Postscriptum. They have a third one called which is just Rorige, just called Rorige, I think. But this is their second wine. Postscriptum after Crisea. Crisea is really quite expensive. But again, you get this lovely perfume Touriga Nacional nose. Delicious. Mm. As this tasting goes on, I don't know how you're doing in wherever you are in Poland. I know you're in all sorts of different places, but I more and more as I taste these delicious wines, I'm thinking, it's so nice to swallow them. Just for the moment, I've got to keep spitting. Okay, this is just a picture. It's a beautiful photo. We were traveling around, Catherine and I, and this is a picture she managed to take up from the side of the road, so you don't have a little bit of car mirror or indeed a little shot of Catherine's thumb. But there's this beautiful rainbow. We'd seen a bit of rain that day, and it was sunny and rainy, perfect conditions for a rainbow. And there it is, to the left of your picture, showing this beautiful, hilly, wonderful terraced region of the Douro, and this illuminated by this rainbow. Right, Formula One, into San Jose. That's our next one. And this one, there you have a picture of the Quinta, and that's where they put up guests. They have a winery. It's a little further up the slope, beyond out of that picture. But this is they have some very nice rooms for rent there, and you can rent the entire house if you want to. So they make some of their money from tourism, but most of it from making wine. Next slide, please. So here we have a good example. That's a patamar. So it's this earth slope, rather than having these old stone walls, which are very labor intensive and have to be repaired whenever you get a heavy rainfall. You have these patamars, which are slopes of earth between rows of vines. Sometimes you get one row only, but in this case, two rows between the vines. And it gives a good example of the modern way of putting vines in a vineyard in the Douro Valley. So, next slide. Now, here is João Briticumnia, who is the owner and winemaker here at San Jose. He's worked all over the place. He started consulting 25 years ago, and then started doing his own thing. And he bought vineyards with his family. He started in Koblenz, then went to the Barossa Valley. He went to Mouette et Chandon. He came back at the end of the 90s, was consulting to Labrador Pateria, Churchills, and then he talked to Christiane van Zeller, who said, who at that stage his family owned Quinta de Rorige, where that Prats and Symington wine came from. And Christiane said, there's this vine not far from Quinta de Rorige. It's up for sale. You might be interested. And so he and his father went to have a look at it, and his father said, it looks pretty good, but there's no road. So they built a road, and they developed the Quinta, and they developed that house at the bottom. And so they now have this beautiful Quinta, Quinta de São José, just next to Quinta de Roriz. So next slide, please. He makes lots of wines. This is the Touriga Nacional. They have a less expensive one called Flor de Quinta de São José. This is, they have a Reserva, which is tremendous, and a wonderful old vine wine. But there you're sort of moving up in price quite a lot. So this is Touriga Nacional. So remember what you've found from the various Tourigas we've tasted so far. They've all been blended. Sorry, Cidro was pure Touriga. This is also pure Touriga Nacional. And you still got that lovely sort of herby perfume, which is so characteristic of the Touriga Nacional grape. Mm. Good tannins, gentle tannins, quite firm. It's 2019 was quite a hot year in the Douro Valley, so it's still got some time to settle down. This, frankly, it's a young wine, but it's got that lovely Touriga Nacional perfume, and this could grace your cellar if you had a cellar and you could afford to keep some wines in it. This would be happy there for quite a few while. So Catherine has also given me another list of things that will go with Touriga Nacional. Because, of course, when you're cooking, it's not just about the main ingredient, whether that's beef or pheasant or whatever. It's the way you cook it, it's the herbs and the spices you use. And she's just given me a list here of other things that would go really well with Touriga Nacional-based wines in the sauce, in the recipe. Herbs like rosemary, oregano, thyme, ginger, garlic. But actually, garlic is tremendous. She said, actually, with tomato, it goes surprisingly well. And as she said before, cardamom, this very unexpected one. And then these cheeses, various that you can have with Touriga Nacional, particularly an aged cheddar, these hard cheeses. Okay, so moving on from Quinta de São José, we're going to go now to Poeira. Poeira, Quinta de Poeira is a creation of Jorge Moreira and his wife, Olga. So that's Quinta de Poeira. It's not very big. You can see that's the house down there, the winery, I should say, because they live in Villarreal. That's the winery down there, and these slopes up the vineyards, sloping down to the winery. They bought the vines first, and then they bought this old ruin. And that ruin is what is now the winery. They did it up. It was a wonderful story because George, who actually let's have a look at George. Next picture, please. There's George. George Moreira. He's the winemaker for Quinta de la Rosa, for Real Companhia Velha, and this his own estate. Except, I would just add, next slide, please. Olga. Do you remember Olga, the CEO of Lavradores de Feitoria? She is George's other half. They are married. They have kids. And George and Olga are the owners of Poeira. Okay, let's move on. It was a great story because George was looking for somewhere where he could have his own vineyard. And he'd been working with Real Companhia Velha, he'd been working with Quinta La Rosa. And he found this vineyard, a small vineyard. And it was a neighbor, told him about a builder in the Pinhão Valley who had a small vineyard up for sale. And so George went to see it, and he thought, wow, that's amazing. It's completely north facing, so cooler for in the hot times of the summer. And he said, well, I don't know. I mean, he got enough money to buy part of it, but he just was short of cash. So he went to talk to Dirk Nieport, who figures in so many stories about the younger generation of the Douro. And Dirk said, okay, let's go and have a look at it. And he went to have a look, and one day it was a Saturday, and they really had no idea what to do. Olga had just started with Labradorish working in sales. And Georges and Dirk went to see this property. And Dirk offered to sell the wine for them. Because, as Georges said, he knew how to make wine, but he had no idea how to sell it. So Dirk said, okay, I'll sell the wine for you. And he did this for 3 years. And so it actually got Georges established, making the wine, and Dirk Nieport was finding the clients for him and selling the wine for him for 3 years. And as Georges said, he never took a penny from it. So that's the kind of friend you need, someone who will give you, take a good idea, run with it, and then help you make it, realize your dream. Okay, Puebla. 70% old vines. Okay, so now we're talking about a blend. Yeah, there's Touriga Nacional in there. There's Touriga Franca in there. There's Sauzon in there. But 70% is a blend of what could be up to 30 different old vines. And those ones referred to by single names, those were the ones that Georges planted in 2001. The rest is old vines now, tasted, foot trodden, fermented in lagars, fermented in French oak. The thing I always think about old vine Douro is that it's almost impossible to define. It's just so complex in a wonderful kind of way. Quite firm tannins, but this is a wine that could age for 20 years. It's delicious now, but it has such a life ahead of it if it's going to age. If you can age it, if you can just taste that aftertaste. It goes on and on and on and on. This is really one of the finest of the wines I think we're going to look at today. From this very talented, youngish winemaker who's got all sorts of ideas about the new ways of planting and pruning vines, going back to the old ways of doing things, because new is not always best. In terms of fermentation, technology, and scientific knowledge, yes, of course, it's good to know about the new ways. But sometimes the old ways of doing things can be really, really valuable. And that's what Georges is doing in terms of his new plantation. I'm afraid we have to move on. I can't sort of stay and rhapsodize endlessly. So we're going to move on to our penultimate wine.
But we have 2 comments. We have 2 comments. Very old. Wow, 1950. I like Portuguese Great Complex. Yeah, very well.
Well, yes. I'm really glad you love it, because I think this is a lovely wine. Okay, we're moving on now then to Quinta da Leda.
And this is Magic in the Bottle, another company.
So here we have Casa Ferreirinha. So this is the mighty Sograp. The company, it's still family owned by the Guedes family. It's still family owned, but the wine that made Sograp was Mateus Rosé. Right in front of my light, my love. So that is Quinta da Leda. It's in the Douro Superior. So you can see the slopes are not as dramatic. And you can, yes, here on the left, you've got some terrace vineyards there, but a bit further on, they're planting on a gentle slope, and they're not having to plant in terraces. So it's much easier to plant here because the slopes are not as dramatic, and you don't have to be as difficult terracing or pâturage or anything, stone walls. So it's south of Foz, so right down in the southeastern corner of the Douro Valley. They've now got a lovely winery there. They used to make their wines at another winery, but they've now got a winery that their top winemaker, Luis Sotomayor, describes as the best winery he's ever seen anywhere in the world. That's Luis. in his winery, looking proudly at his winery. It was Salvador Guedes, who sadly is no longer with us, bought it in 2005, and it's got 170 hectares of vineyard now. There were only 20 hectares when he first went there. Barcavelha, this famous red wine from Portugal, all comes from Quinta de Leda, and they've got a bit of Sauzao in there, but it's mostly Touriga Nacional, Touriga Franca, and Tinta Roriz, with a little bit of Tinta Cao as well. So he didn't show me many wines. I had done a vertical tasting of all of the wines ever produced at Quinta de Leda last November in Lisbon. So I had tasted this wine before, this 2019. And one thing I know from that vertical tasting is these wines keep, I hesitate to say forever, they keep a long time. The oldest of the wines was still in very good shape. So this, even though it's only 3 years, 4 years old, it's still quite closed. It's still very much in its early life. There are the grapes there, Touriga Franca, slightly more than Touriga Nacional, and then Tinta Cao, this high acid, pale skinned grape variety, and Tinta Roriz, Tempranillo, 10% each of those last two. It gets 18 months out in 18 months of 50% and 50% used French oak. So it's got quite a strong oak influence. And it's still showing that a bit on the nose, I think. Still pretty firm, but length, concentration, lovely acidity, beautiful balance. It just needs time, which is what we don't have very much of. I could go on a long time about Sograp and Luis, who's an absolute wizard winemaker. They also showed us their Vinho Grande Branco, and he showed us a wine called Castas Escondidas, which means forgotten grape varieties. And I'm just going to read the list of things. He said, Tinta Amarela, okay, that's not forgotten really, but Touriga Femmea, not Touriga Francesa, Touriga Femmea, the feminine Touriga, different grape. Tinta da Barca, the grape of the red of the boat. Bastardo Francisca, Tinta Francisca, we've had that before. Morisco, a very old grape variety of Douro, very, very sweet. No one wanted to use it. Everyone wanted it for port. But now it helps prolong fermentation. And then one called Tinta Nebuleiro, which means foggy red. So extraordinary lineup, but I had to choose Quinta de Leda because it is such an emblematic Quinta. There's such an important winery associated with it. And that's why Luis has made some of the best wines that he has made in the Douro Valley. Okay, last wine about to come up. And that is a wine from, and now unusually, we're going back to the lower Corgo. So that is the western part of the Douro Valley. And this is one of the quintas owned by this family. I think they've got 5 estates in total. This is Quinta da Gaivosa, where this wine comes from. And it's the Alves de Souza family. So next slide, please. Those are the 2 main players now in the company, father and son. Domingos father and Tiago is the son. Domingos qualified as a civil engineer and then came home to run the family estates. And they now, as I say, I think they have 5 quintas. And they make sensationally good wines. And a point worth making, Domingos was one of the first people to start making serious attempts at unfortified wine. Yes, they made port. They still make port to a smaller extent, but their main effort went into unfortified wines. And he was one of the first people really to try very hard to make good unfortified wines. Tiago, his son, trained as a winemaker from the very beginning, and he's a very talented winemaker. have also, he showed me all sorts of extraordinary wines. He showed me a brilliant white wine, the Passoir, which is subjected to hyperoxidation. So before they ferment it, they actually get rid of anything that could drop out. And when it goes into the fermentation as a dark brown color, which drops out later. And it's an extraordinary wine. Then he showed me a brilliant rosé Celeste, named after his grandmother. And then he showed me a wine from the Val de Raposa, another of their Quintas, Quinta Gaivosa, lovely wine. And then the Quinta Gaivosa Vinha de Lordelo, which is this one you see. This, again, this is probably the oldest vine. It says over 100 years old. Tiago said, well, probably the average is about 120. So these are very old vines. He said at least 30 different varieties. So fermented in stainless steel, and then he's giving them 20 months in French oak, of which about 50% is new. It's the most expensive wine in our tasting. And there's another emblematic wine from old vine wine from Alves de Souza, which is called Abandonado, because it's made from grapes from a vineyard that had been abandoned. They were about to rip it up when Tiago said, I think maybe we should try making some wine from this. And it's now their most famous and probably most expensive wine. So this is very nearly 100 euros a bottle. And I just think this is an astonishing wine. Extraordinary concentration, explosive fruit. This is my tasting. A lively fragrance, palate intensely bright, tannins firm and elegant, beautiful fragrance. I think I have a huge respect for Touriga Nacional, and it can make some wonderful solo wines. But when you get an old vine blend like this, it's a different level of quality. And this is, I think, a sensational wine. Last wine of the tasting. I don't need to spit that out, I'm happy to say. It's got very firm tannins, but this is a wine that will go on 20, 30 years. We're tasting it today. It's very impressive today, but it has a long future in front of it. And Alves de Souza, their wines are sensational. They may come from a slightly less famous part of the Douro Valley, but their wines are brilliant. Okay, guys, just one nice last picture of the Douro to show you. The Douro in the morning with mist covering the Douro. It'll burn off during the day to reveal the sun on the vines underneath. It's a magical river, and it's responsible for some of Portugal's best wines. Piotr.
Wow, Charles. Let's just let me read the two last comments in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
What an ending! Marvelous wine, full body, fruitiness. Wow. And the second comment is from a male, Rafael. Wow.
Good. I'm delighted you love them.
So they like it. Thank you very much, Charles.
Good.
Thank you very much. Well done. Great job. And well, if you want to ask anything.
Yes, do, if you want to ask questions. Some of these, I don't know that I've always referred to the stockists in Poland where there are stockists in Poland, but quite a few of these do not have any exposure to Poland at the moment at all. Yeah. So, go onto their websites, have a look, and, if you like the wines, see if you can buy them, because I think these are some of the best wines in the Douro. Yes, there are more famous names, the Douro boys, for instance. I think Pietra's already done a tasting of Douro boys wines. They are really, really talented winemakers. These guys, some of them, it's part of this new Douro group, and some of them make absolutely sensational wines. Yeah, do ask questions if you want to. If not, just relax back and enjoy your
someone is
bottles.
typing. Someone is
Okay.
typing something. For sure, Ramos Pinto is in Poland. Wine and Soul is in Poland.
Yeah. Good.
Quinta do Cidro.
Yes.
And well, the Alves de Sousa.
Real Compagnia Velia, I know.
Yeah, sure, yes.
Wines.
Well,
Next time, I propose to spend more time on the wines from the end of the range. Yes, we took too long.
well, there's a complaint. There's a complaint about the time
Yeah, yeah.
sharing. We should more time have for the end of the tasting,
Okay.
and less for
That's
the
a
beginning.
very fair point. Okay.
Yeah.
I have to go faster at the beginning.
No, it was very well. Yeah, we will take it into the consideration. Yes, that's what we say.
Good. Good. Fine.
Very
Very
well.
good. A fair point to make.
Guys, thank you very much. Charles, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
And,
Pleasure.
yeah, so Charles Metcalfe returns on July 24th, hopefully, with the Vinho Verde. Right?
We hope. Yeah, I mean, I'm all ready for it. We just hope we can get the wines from Vinho Verde to Poland in time for the tasting.
Yes.
Yeah, good.
So,
thank you very much. I've enjoyed it enormously. It was great going and visiting all these wineries again and seeing what they're doing. They're up-to-date news and tasting with the winemakers, in almost all cases, the winemakers, and just reminding myself what a wonderful place the Douro Valley is. But Vinho Verde is a different thing. And I think there are very exciting things happening in Vinho Verde, which you might not have met. Everyone has the idea that Vinho Verde is deep, it's fizzy, it's sweet. It's not all like that. There are some very interesting exceptions to that normal picture of Vinho Verde. So if you can join us on the 26th of July, that would be great.
24th.
24th, sorry.
24th.
Today's the 26th.
26th is
Yeah.
also good. Yes.
Yeah, 24th.
Good.
24th.
Yes. And thank you, guys. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, guys, and stay in touch. Yeah.
Thank you, Piotr, for organizing it all.
Thank you. Have a good
Great.
evening.
Okay, thanks very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Dziękuję.
Dzień dobry. Dziękuję. Biedronka. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.